Westfield, California, was a town straight out of a postcard, a place where every lawn was immaculately trimmed, and every house seemed to shine under the golden sun. It was the kind of town where nothing ever appeared out of place, where life was so idyllic that it was almost hard to believe. Nestled in the heart of this seemingly perfect suburb was the Parker family. By all accounts, embodied the very essence of the American dream. David Parker was a 42-year-old respected doctor at the local hospital, known for his calm demeanor and skilled hands. Born and raised in Seattle, David had moved to California in his early 30s to escape the dreary weather of the Pacific Northwest. He had graduated at the top of his class from Stanford Medical School and had quickly built a reputation as one of the best physicians in the area. Tall and handsome, with a commanding presence, David was the kind of man who could walk into a room and immediately draw attention. He had a warm, reassuring smile that made his patients trust him implicitly, and his colleagues often remarked on his unwavering dedication to his work. Emma Parker, at 38, was the epitome of grace and elegance. Originally from a small town in Ohio, she had moved to California after college, drawn by the allure of the West Coast's endless possibilities. She had studied interior design at UCLA, but had chosen to put her career on hold after marrying David and becoming a mother. Emma was the type of woman who could turn a house into a home with just a few thoughtful touches. She was slender and always impeccably dressed, her blonde hair styled in soft waves that framed her delicate features. Emma was known for her kindness and her involvement in the community, from organizing charity events to hosting book clubs. To the outside world, she was the perfect wife and mother. The Parkers had two children, 10-year-old Lily and 8-year-old Ethan. Both children were bright and well-mannered, excelling in school and extracurricular activities. Lily was a budding pianist, already performing at local recitals, while Ethan was the star of his Little League baseball team. The Parker family lived in a beautiful two-story house at the end of a cul-de-sac, a home that looked as though it had been plucked from the pages of a magazine. It had a manicured lawn, a white picket fence, and large windows that let in the California sunshine. Every morning, the family sat down together for breakfast, and every evening they gathered around the dinner table to share stories about their day. They were, in every sense of the word, the perfect family. For years, Emma had been content in her life. She loved her husband, adored her children, and took pride in her role as the caretaker of their home. But recently, she had begun to notice small changes in David's behavior that she couldn't quite explain. He had always worked long hours at the hospital, but lately he seemed more distant, more preoccupied. He often came home late, well after the children had gone to bed, and when he did, he was irritable and short-tempered. The warm, loving husband she had known seemed to be slipping away, replaced by someone she barely recognized. It wasn't just the late nights that worried her. David had started locking his study door, something he had never done before. When Emma asked him about it, he brushed off her concerns, saying that he was working on confidential patient files and didn't want to risk any breaches of privacy. But the way he said it, with a tightness in his voice and a refusal to meet her eyes, only heightened her unease. She also noticed that he had started carrying a second phone, one he kept hidden away and only used when he thought she wasn't around. When she asked him about it, he dismissed it as a work phone, something necessary for the hospital's on-call system. But she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from her. One evening, as Emma was preparing dinner, David's phone rang. It was his work phone, the one he had always kept out of her sight. David was in the shower, so Emma answered it, expecting to hear one of his colleagues on the other end. Instead, there was silence, followed by a woman's voice, hushed and urgent. "David, we need to talk. I can't keep doing this. It's getting too dangerous." Before Emma could respond, the line went dead. She stood frozen in the kitchen, the phone still in her hand, her mind racing. Who was this woman? And what did she mean by dangerous? That night, Emma didn't mention the call to David. She tried to act normal, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. She replayed the conversation over and over in her mind, searching for clues in the woman's voice, trying to decipher what it all meant. As she lay in bed next to her husband, listening to his steady breathing, she felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and she didn't know how to confront it. A few weeks later, on a rainy Saturday afternoon, David took the kids out for the day to give Emma some time to herself. She appreciated the gesture, but her mind was still troubled. She had become increasingly suspicious of David's behavior and had even started to keep a journal, documenting the little things she noticed. The late nights, the locked study door, the mysterious phone calls. That afternoon, she decided to take matters into her own hands. With David and the children out of the house, Emma had the perfect opportunity to snoop around his study, something she had never done before but now felt was necessary. Emma's hands trembled as she approached the study door. She had always respected David's privacy, but this was different. She needed answers. She quietly unlocked the door with the spare key she had found in the kitchen drawer and stepped inside. The study was a masculine space, filled with dark wood furniture, leather-bound books, and framed certificates on the walls. It smelled faintly of David's cologne, a scent that had always comforted her, but now only made her feel uneasy. She started with his desk, opening the drawers one by one, careful not to disturb anything that might give away her intrusion. The first few drawers contained nothing unusual: pens, paper, a few old receipts. But then she found a drawer that was locked. Her heart pounded as she examined it, realizing that it wasn't locked with a key but rather with a small latch on the inside. She managed to open it, and inside she found a metal box. Her breath caught in her throat as she carefully lifted the box out and placed it on the desk. Inside the box was a small stack of cash, neatly bound with rubber bands. Next to the cash were several prescription pads, the kind doctors used to write prescriptions. But what caught Emma's attention were the documents at the bottom of the box. They were patient files, each one marked with a red X at the top. Emma recognized some of the names. These were patients who had died recently under David's care. She leafed through the files, noting that many of the deaths had been ruled as accidental overdoses, but the details didn't add up. The dosages were far too high, and in some cases, the patients had been prescribed medications they had no history of needing. Emma felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she realized what she was looking at. David had been involved in something illegal, something dangerous. The woman on the phone, the late nights, the locked door, it all began to make sense. But what was even more terrifying was the thought that David wasn't just involved in illegal activities. He might have been directly responsible for the deaths of his patients. Emma quickly put everything back in its place, locking the drawer and closing the study door behind her. She felt as though she was in a daze, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just discovered. She wanted to confront David immediately, but she knew she had to be careful. If he was capable of such terrible things, what else was he capable of? And how could she protect herself and her children if she exposed him? Over the next few days, Emma became increasingly paranoid. She started noticing things she had never paid attention to before, like the way David would glance at his phone and then quickly put it away when she walked into the room, or the way he avoided making eye contact with her when she asked about his day. She began to feel like a stranger in her own home, constantly on edge, always watching, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Emma tried to bring up the topic of David's work, hoping to gauge his reaction. "You've been working so hard lately," she said, forcing a smile. "Is everything okay at the hospital?" David looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable. "Just busy," he replied curtly. "Nothing I can't handle." "But you've been so stressed," Emma pressed gently. "Maybe you should take some time off, spend more time with us." David's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Emma thought she saw a flicker of something dark pass over his face. "I'm fine, Emma," he said, his tone sharper than before. "There's nothing to worry about." But there was something to worry about, and Emma knew it. She could feel the tension between them, like a taut wire ready to snap at any moment. She was terrified of what might happen when it did. A few days later, the phone rang again. This time, Emma was alone in the house, and the call came through on David's work phone, the one he always kept hidden. Her heart pounded as she stared at the phone, debating whether to answer it. Finally, she picked it up, her hand trembling. "Hello," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause on the other end, and then the same woman's voice, tense and urgent. "David, we need to talk. Things are getting out of control. I don't know how much longer I can keep this quiet." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to speak, but the line went dead before she could say anything. She stared at the phone in her hand, her mind spinning. Who was this woman? And what was she talking about? Emma knew she couldn't keep this to herself any longer. She needed to find out the truth, and she needed to do it quickly. But she was terrified of what she might uncover, and even more terrified of what David might do if he found out she was snooping around. That night, as she lay in bed next to David, she made a decision. She would gather as much information as she could, and when she had enough, she would go to the authorities. But she would have to be careful, very careful, because if David suspected anything, she had no doubt that he would do whatever it took to protect his secrets, even if it meant silencing her for good. As the days passed, Emma's fear only grew. The man she had once loved, the father of her children, was now a stranger to her. She began to avoid him, making excuses to stay out of the house or to keep the children away. She could no longer trust him, and the thought of what he might be capable of haunted her every waking moment. The perfect life they had built together, the perfect family they had created, was nothing more than an illusion. And as that illusion began to crumble, Emma knew that she was in more danger than she had ever imagined. The idyllic suburb of Westfield, with its pristine lawns and friendly neighbors, was no longer a safe haven. It was a prison, and she was trapped inside, with no idea how to escape. But escape she must, for the sake of her children, for the sake of her sanity. She just didn't know how. Yet, Emma Parker's life had turned into a waking nightmare. The once secure, happy world she had known was unraveling, and she felt as though she were living with a stranger. Every day brought a new wave of anxiety, and every night was filled with restless, sleepless hours as she tried to piece together the dark puzzle that had become her life. The discovery of the hidden drawer in David's study had shaken her to the core, but it was the mysterious phone call that had finally pushed her over the edge. She knew she couldn't continue living in ignorance. She needed to uncover the truth about her husband, no matter how terrifying it might be. Emma had always been a strong, determined woman, but now she found herself plagued by self-doubt. She was a wife and mother, not a detective. How could she possibly conduct an investigation into something so sinister and complex? But as the days passed, her fear and uncertainty began to transform into a quiet resolve. She had to protect her children, and that meant she had to understand exactly what David was involved in. There was no turning back. The first step was to gather more evidence. Emma knew she couldn't confront David without solid proof, and she couldn't risk him discovering what she was up to. She had to be careful, methodical, and above all, discreet. She started by reviewing everything she had already found in David's study. Late at night, after David had gone to bed, she would sneak into the study, unlock the hidden drawer, and examine the contents again. Each time, she noticed new details, small, seemingly insignificant things that added to the larger picture. One of the most troubling aspects was the patient files. The red X marked at the top of each file haunted her. She recognized many of the names. They were people who had been in the local news, patients who had died under mysterious circumstances, often involving overdoses or unexpected complications. As she read through the files, she noticed discrepancies in the medical records. Notes that seemed out of place, treatments that didn't align with the patient's known conditions, and prescriptions that had been filled just days before the patient's deaths. Emma's medical knowledge was limited, but even she could tell that something was terribly wrong. She also found several checks made out to cash, large sums that David had withdrawn from their joint account. The dates on the checks coincided with the dates of the patient's deaths. Emma couldn't be sure, but she suspected that these withdrawals were connected to whatever illegal activities David was involved in. The thought made her sick to her stomach. Was David being paid off to cover up his mistakes? Or worse, was he actively participating in something far more sinister? Emma began to take pictures of everything she found, using her phone to document the evidence. She knew she couldn't keep any of the physical documents. If David discovered they were missing, it would raise immediate suspicion. She also started to research the patients whose names were in the files, combing through online obituaries, news articles, and medical forums. The more she learned, the more horrified she became. Many of the patients had been elderly or terminally ill, people who might not have raised too many questions if they died unexpectedly. But there were others, younger and seemingly healthier, whose deaths had been more shocking to the community. In each case, the official cause of death had been listed as natural or accidental, but Emma now believed that these deaths were anything but. As Emma's investigation deepened, she realized she needed help. She was in way over her head, and she couldn't risk going to the police without more concrete evidence. She considered hiring a private investigator, but she worried that doing so might alert David. He had connections in the community, and she couldn't be sure who might be loyal to him, or who might be willing to betray her for the right price. Instead, she decided to reach out to someone who had the skills and experience to help her without raising suspicion. A journalist. Emma remembered a local reporter, Sarah Mitchell, who had written a series of investigative articles about corruption in the healthcare industry. Sarah was known for her tenacity and her willingness to dig deep into stories that others were too afraid to touch. Emma had met her briefly at a charity event a few years ago, and while they weren't friends, she hoped that Sarah might be willing to listen to her story. One afternoon, while David was at work and the children were at school, Emma sent Sarah an email from a new account she had created under a fake name. She explained that she had information about a series of suspicious deaths at the local hospital, and that she believed a well-respected doctor was involved. She didn't mention David by name, but she hinted that the doctor was someone with a lot of influence and that she was afraid for her safety. She asked Sarah to meet her in person at a coffee shop on the other side of town, where they wouldn't be recognized. Sarah responded within an hour, agreeing to the meeting and assuring Emma that she would handle the situation with the utmost discretion. Emma's heart pounded as she read the email. She knew that once she met with Sarah, there would be no going back. But she also knew that she couldn't do this alone. The day of the meeting, Emma was a bundle of nerves. She chose a simple outfit, jeans, a sweater, and a baseball cap, to avoid drawing attention to herself. She arrived at the coffee shop early and chose a table in the back corner, where she could see the door, but remained somewhat hidden. She ordered a cup of tea, but her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely hold the cup. When Sarah walked in, Emma recognized her immediately. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back into a ponytail and a confident, no-nonsense demeanor. She was dressed casually, but there was an air of professionalism about her that made Emma feel slightly more at ease. Sarah spotted Emma and made her way over, sliding into the seat across from her. "Thank you for meeting me," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. "Of course," Sarah replied, her tone gentle but focused. "I understand you're in a difficult situation. I want you to know that whatever you tell me will remain confidential. I'm here to help." Emma took a deep breath and began to explain everything. She started with the changes in David's behavior, the late nights, the locked study, and the second phone. Then she told Sarah about the hidden drawer, the patient files, and the mysterious phone calls. She showed Sarah the pictures she had taken, explaining her suspicions about the deaths and the possible connections to David. Sarah listened intently, taking notes and asking occasional questions to clarify details. As Emma spoke, she could see the journalist's expression shift from curiosity to concern, and finally to a grim determination. "This is serious," Sarah said when Emma had finished. "If what you're saying is true, this could be a huge scandal, but we need more evidence. The documents you found are a start, but we need to link them directly to your husband's actions. That means digging deeper into his finances, his communications, and most importantly, the hospital records." Emma nodded, feeling a surge of both fear and relief. She had taken the first step, and now she had someone on her side who knew what to do next. Over the next few weeks, Emma and Sarah worked together to gather more evidence. Sarah instructed Emma on how to access David's financial records without alerting him, teaching her how to use encryption software and secure communication methods to avoid detection. Emma was terrified of getting caught, but she knew that she had to press forward. Emma began by accessing their joint bank accounts, carefully examining each transaction for anything suspicious. It didn't take long for her to find a pattern. Large cash withdrawals, often made shortly before or after the deaths of David's patients. The amounts varied, but they were all significant, and they all coincided with the dates in the patient files. Emma also found payments to several shell companies, businesses that appeared to be legitimate on the surface, but had no real operations. These payments were often labeled as consulting fees or medical supplies, but they seemed far too large for what they supposedly covered. Emma shared all of this information with Sarah, who used her contacts in the financial world to dig deeper into the shell companies. It turned out that these companies were fronts for laundering money that likely came from illegal activities related to the hospital. Sarah also discovered that one of the companies was linked to a known criminal organization, which had been under investigation by federal authorities for years. This connection was the smoking gun they needed, proof that David was involved in something far more dangerous than Emma had initially suspected. Next, Sarah advised Emma on how to access David's phone records and emails. This was far more difficult and risky, as David had password-protected everything and was careful about what he left on his devices. Emma knew that if David noticed any unusual activity on his accounts, he would become suspicious, so she had to be incredibly cautious. Emma started by examining the second phone, the one David kept hidden. She waited until he was in the shower, then quickly took the phone and copied the contacts, messages, and call logs. Most of the calls and texts were encrypted or deleted, but a few had slipped through. Emma found several messages from the same unknown number, the one that had called and left the cryptic messages. The messages were short and vague, but they spoke of arrangements and deliveries, as well as warnings to stay under the radar. There were also several calls made late at night, often just before or after the cash withdrawals Emma had found. Sarah analyzed the phone data and confirmed that the unknown number was linked to a burner phone, a tactic often used by criminals to avoid detection. This number had also been in contact with several other phones linked to the shell companies, further connecting David to the illegal activities. The last piece of the puzzle was the hospital records. Sarah knew that accessing these without David's knowledge would be the most difficult and dangerous task, but it was also the most crucial. They needed to prove that David had been directly involved in the suspicious deaths, and that meant getting inside information from the hospital itself. Emma was terrified at the thought of breaking into the hospital system, but Sarah assured her that there were ways to do it without getting caught. They enlisted the help of a tech-savvy friend of Sarah's, someone who specialized in cybersecurity and could guide Emma through the process. This friend provided Emma with the tools and instructions she needed to access the hospital's records remotely, without leaving a trace. Late one night, after David had gone to bed, Emma sat at her computer, her hands trembling as she followed the instructions. She was terrified that she would make a mistake, that David would somehow discover what she was doing. But she pushed her fear aside and focused on the task at hand. After what felt like an eternity, she finally gained access to the hospital system. Emma quickly searched for the names of the patients whose files she had found in David's study. The records were extensive, but Emma knew what she was looking for: the discrepancies in the medical notes, the unusual prescriptions, and the times and dates that didn't match up. As she pored over the files, she found more and more evidence that David had manipulated the records to cover up his actions. There were signs of falsified documents, backdated notes, and even forged signatures. Emma couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was as though David had been living a double life, one that she had never even suspected. Emma took screenshots of everything, carefully saving the evidence on an encrypted drive that Sarah had provided. She knew that this information was their ticket to exposing David, but it was also incredibly dangerous. If David found out what she had done, there was no telling what he might do. As Emma and Sarah continued their investigation, the tension in the Parker household reached a boiling point. David had become more distant and irritable, snapping at Emma and the children for the slightest provocation. He seemed to sense that something was wrong, but Emma did her best to maintain the facade of a dutiful wife. Every interaction with him felt like a minefield, and Emma was constantly on edge, afraid that she would say or do something to tip him off. David's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He started coming home even later than usual, often reeking of alcohol, and would lock himself in his study for hours. Emma noticed that he had begun carrying his second phone with him at all times, even taking it into the bathroom when he showered. He also started receiving more frequent phone calls, which he would take outside or in his car, away from Emma's ears. She knew that whatever was going on, it was escalating, and she was running out of time. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, David confronted Emma. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face was flushed with anger. "You've been acting strange lately," he said, his voice low and threatening. "What's going on, Emma?" Emma's heart raced as she struggled to keep her composure. "I'm just worried about you," she replied, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You've been so stressed, and I feel like you're not telling me everything." "Just want to help." David stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, but there was no warmth in his response. "I'm fine. Just stay out of my business, Emma. Don't make things harder than they already are." Emma nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat as David turned and walked away. She knew that the clock was ticking, and she had to act before it was too late. As Emma lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, she knew that her time was running out. She had gathered enough evidence to expose David, but she needed to be smart about how she did it. She couldn't just go to the police. She needed to ensure that David couldn't hurt her or the children once the truth came out. Emma and Sarah made a plan. They would compile all the evidence and present it to the authorities, but they would also go public with the story through Sarah's news outlet. That way, even if David tried to cover his tracks, the truth would be out in the open, and he wouldn't be able to escape justice. But as Emma prepared for the final confrontation, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over her like a dark cloud. She knew that David was a dangerous man, and if he realized what she was about to do, there was no telling how far he would go to protect his secrets. The calm before the storm was almost over, and Emma could feel the winds of change beginning to stir. She only hoped that she and her children would survive the tempest that was about to be unleashed. The weeks that followed Emma's decision to expose David were some of the most harrowing of her life. Every moment felt like a precarious balancing act, as if she were walking a tightrope over a dark abyss, with David's shadow lurking beneath her. The tension in the house was palpable, and Emma's anxiety grew with each passing day. She knew that the time for action was drawing near, and there was no room for error. Sarah had been instrumental in helping Emma compile the evidence. The two women communicated through encrypted emails, and burner phones, ensuring that their conversations remained undetected. Together, they built a dossier of damning evidence: the falsified hospital records, the suspicious financial transactions, and the incriminating messages from David's secret phone. Each piece of the puzzle painted a clearer picture of David's criminal activities. But the final step, confronting him and involving the authorities, was the most dangerous of all. Emma and Sarah devised a plan that involved careful coordination with the police. Sarah had used her connections to discreetly inform a trusted detective about the situation, someone who was not only reliable, but also willing to work under the radar to avoid tipping David off. The detective agreed to help, but he warned that once the wheels were set in motion, there would be no turning back. David's reaction could be unpredictable, and Emma had to be prepared for the worst. The plan was simple yet fraught with risk. Emma would confront David with the evidence, while the police waited nearby, ready to intervene at the first sign of danger. The confrontation would be recorded, and Sarah would be on standby to publish the story if anything went wrong. Emma knew that this was the moment she had been dreading, the moment when she would finally face the man who had once been her loving husband, but was now a terrifying stranger. There was no way to predict how David would react, but Emma was determined to see it through, for the sake of her children and her own survival. The day of the confrontation dawned cold and gray, a fitting backdrop for the storm that was about to break. Emma woke early, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. She dressed carefully, choosing a plain, unassuming outfit that allowed her to move easily. Her hands trembled as she fastened a small microphone to her collar, hidden beneath her sweater. The police had provided it, along with instructions on how to activate it when the time came. David had been increasingly erratic over the past few days, and Emma could sense that he was on edge. He had been drinking more heavily, and his temper flared at the slightest provocation. The children had become frightened of him, and Emma did everything she could to shield them from his anger. But today, she knew, there would be no avoiding the confrontation. David had planned to spend the day at home, something he rarely did anymore. He claimed he needed to catch up on paperwork, but Emma suspected he was trying to keep an eye on her. She could feel his gaze following her every move, and it sent shivers down her spine. Around mid-morning, when the children were at school and the house was quiet, Emma knew the time had come. She found David in his study, surrounded by stacks of papers and empty whiskey glasses. He looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What do you want, Emma?" he asked, his voice cold and impatient. Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to do. "We need to talk, David," she said, keeping her voice steady. "There are things I found out, things you need to explain." David's expression hardened. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "I don't have time for your games." Emma walked over to his desk and placed a folder in front of him, the dossier of evidence she and Sarah had compiled. "This," she said quietly. "I know what you've been doing, David. I know about the patients, the money, the cover-ups, and I know it's all going to come crashing down." David stared at the folder, his face draining of color. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he swept the papers off the desk, sending them flying across the room. "You have no idea what you've just done," he hissed, rising from his chair. His voice was low and dangerous, his eyes burning with a fury Emma had never seen before. "Do you think you can just waltz in here and accuse me of what? Murder? Fraud? You're delusional." Emma stood her ground, though her heart was racing. "I have proof, David. The police know everything. It's over." David's expression twisted into one of pure rage. He advanced on her, his fists clenched, and for a terrifying moment, Emma thought he might hit her. She backed away, her hand instinctively reaching for the phone in her pocket, ready to signal the police. But then, something in David's face changed. The anger remained, but it was now mixed with something else: desperation. He stopped in his tracks, staring at her with wild, haunted eyes. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "I didn't have a choice. They forced me. If I didn't do what they asked, they would have destroyed everything. Our lives, our family. I had to protect you, Emma. I did it for us." Emma felt a wave of revulsion. "Protect us," she echoed, her voice thick with disbelief. "By killing innocent people, by ruining lives. How could you possibly think that would protect anyone?" David looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something like guilt in his eyes. "Didn't want to do it," he said, almost pleading. "But once I was in, there was no way out. They would have killed me, killed all of us. I thought if I could just play along, I could find a way to fix it, to make it right." Emma shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "There's no fixing this, David. It's too late." Before David could respond, the front door burst open, and armed police officers swarmed into the room. Emma stepped back as they surrounded David, who offered no resistance as they handcuffed him. He looked at Emma one last time, his expression a mix of anger, fear, and something she couldn't quite identify. Perhaps regret, or maybe just resignation. As they led David away, Emma felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching the scene unfold from a distance. The man she had loved, the father of her children, was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. The nightmare was over, but the reality that replaced it was no less terrifying. The days following David's arrest were a blur of police interviews, media scrutiny, and emotional turmoil. The story quickly became a sensation, splashed across the front pages of newspapers, and featured on every news channel. Emma's quiet suburban life was shattered, replaced by a maelstrom of public attention and private anguish. Sarah published the story with meticulous care, ensuring that the truth about David's crimes was fully exposed. The investigation revealed a web of corruption that extended far beyond David's actions. It turned out that he had been part of a larger criminal enterprise involving several high-ranking officials at the hospital and members of a powerful crime syndicate. The hospital had been covering up malpractice, falsifying records, and accepting bribes in exchange for allowing unsafe practices that led to the deaths of numerous patients. David had been their inside man, ensuring that any evidence of wrongdoing was destroyed before it could reach the authorities. The revelations led to a massive crackdown on the hospital, with multiple arrests and a federal investigation into the wider network of corruption. But for Emma, the public spectacle was secondary to the personal devastation she faced. Her home had become a war zone of memories, both good and bad, and the man she had once loved was now a convicted criminal facing life in prison. Emma struggled to shield her children from the worst of the media attention. They were too young to fully understand what was happening, but they sensed the tension and fear that hung over the household. Emma did her best to maintain a sense of normalcy, enrolling them in therapy and moving them to a new school in hopes of giving them a fresh start. But the scars of what had happened would not fade easily. For Emma, the hardest part was coming to terms with the betrayal. She spent countless sleepless nights replaying every moment of her marriage, wondering how she had missed the signs, how she could have been so blind to the man David had become. The guilt was overwhelming. Guilt for not seeing the truth sooner, guilt for bringing the police into their lives, and most of all, guilt for what her children were now enduring. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, Emma began to find a strange sense of strength in her pain. The support from friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had followed her story was overwhelming. People reached out with messages of encouragement, offering help with the children, legal advice, and simply letting her know that she was not alone. Sarah, too, remained a steadfast ally, checking in regularly and helping Emma navigate the complicated legal aftermath. Emma also threw herself into the process of rebuilding her life. She filed for divorce and sold the house, using the proceeds to move to a smaller, more manageable home in a nearby town. She took a job at a local community center, working with other women who had been victims of domestic abuse and trauma. The work was cathartic, giving her a sense of purpose and reminding her that she was not the only one who had suffered through such horrors. The culmination of Emma's journey came in the courtroom, where she was called to testify against David. It was the final step in her quest for justice, and one that filled her with dread. Facing him again, after all that had happened, was almost too much to bear. But she knew it was necessary, both for herself and for the victims of his crimes. The trial was a grueling affair, with David's defense team doing everything they could to discredit the evidence and paint him as a man who had been coerced into his actions. But the prosecution was relentless, presenting a mountain of evidence that Emma and Sarah had gathered, along with testimonies from others who had been involved in the scheme. The courtroom was packed with reporters and onlookers, all eager to see how the drama would unfold. When it was Emma's turn to take the stand, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She forced herself to meet David's gaze as she walked to the witness box. But what she saw in his eyes was not the man she had married. He looked gaunt, almost hollowed out, as if the weight of his sins had finally taken its toll. There was no trace of the charm or confidence he had once possessed. Instead, he seemed broken, a shell of the person he had been. The questioning was brutal. The defense tried to paint Emma as a vindictive wife who had set out to destroy her husband, but she remained calm, answering each question with the truth she had painstakingly uncovered. The prosecution, on the other hand, treated her with respect, guiding her through her testimony and allowing her to tell her story in her own words. When it was over, Emma felt a strange sense of relief. She had faced her fears, confronted the man who had betrayed her, and played her part in ensuring that justice was served. The jury deliberated for several days before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. David was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment that brought a sense of closure, if not comfort. In the months and years that followed, Emma slowly began to rebuild her life. It was not an easy process. The wounds of betrayal and trauma ran deep, and there were days when the weight of it all seemed unbearable. But Emma was determined not to let her past define her future. She continued her work at the community center, eventually becoming a leading advocate for victims of domestic abuse and corruption. Her story, once a sensational headline, became a source of inspiration for others who had faced similar struggles. Emma's resilience and courage were widely recognized, and she was invited to speak at conferences and events, sharing her experience and the lessons she had learned. Emma's children, too, began to heal. They grew up in a loving, supportive environment, surrounded by people who cared for them and helped them understand the difficult truths about their father. As they matured, they came to appreciate the strength their mother had shown in protecting them and fighting for justice. Emma knew that the scars of her past would never fully disappear, but she had learned to live with them. She had faced the storm, weathered its fury, and emerged on the other side stronger and wiser. The man who had once been the center of her world was now a distant memory, a reminder of the darkness that could lurk behind even the most familiar faces. But more than anything, Emma had found a sense of peace. She had done what she needed to do, not just for herself, but for the victims who had suffered at David's hands. She had exposed the truth, brought a criminal to justice, and reclaimed her life from the shadow of fear and betrayal. As Emma stood on the porch of her new home, watching her children play in the yard, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. The journey had been long and painful, but she had survived it. She had found her strength in the midst of the storm, and now, at last, she was free.